In 1810, a pound of sugar cost the average English worker a full day's wages. By 1900, factory workers were stirring it into their tea 3 times a day. That transformation from luxury to everyday staple changed the world more than almost any other commodity in history. But sugar's story does not begin in England or on a plantation. It begins in a jungle nearly 10,000 years ago. On the island of New Guinea, deep in the South Pacific, indigenous people discovered something growing wild in the tropical lowlands, a tall, thick grass with a fibrous stalk. They pulled it from the ground, bit into it, and tasted something no human had ever experienced in that form: pure, concentrated sweetness. Raw sugarcane. For thousands of years, that was the full extent of sugar's reach. People in New Guinea and across the Pacific Islands chewed raw sugarcane for energy and enjoyment. There was no refining, no processing, no trade, just people biting into a stalk and savoring its sweet juice. Over generations, sugarcane spread slowly across Southeast Asia through migration and early trade routes. By around 3,500 BC, it had reached the Indian subcontinent. That is where everything changed. Ancient Indian farmers did not simply chew the cane. They learned how to crush it, boil the juice, and allow the liquid to crystallize into a rough, brown solid. They called it khanda, the origin of the English word candy. For the first time in history, sugar could be stored and transported. It was no longer tied to the living stalk. India had effectively invented sugar as a product. Ancient texts described it with reverence, and physicians across the subcontinent prescribed it as medicine for headaches, stomach ailments, and even impotence. Sugar was sacred. Around 326 BC, Alexander the Great marched into India. His soldiers returned with stories of a remarkable plant. Nerkes, one of Alexander's officers, described finding a reed that produces honey without bees. The Greeks were astonished. They already had honey, but the idea that sweetness could come from a grass growing out of the ground seemed almost impossible. Even so, sugar remained an exotic curiosity in the Western world for centuries. It was too expensive, too difficult to transport, and too far away to influence daily life in Greece or Rome. When sugar finally appeared in Roman pharmacies centuries later, it was sold only in tiny quantities at prices only the wealthiest citizens could afford. Roman doctors prescribed it for stomach ailments and eye infections. A single pound could cost the equivalent of an entire month's wages for a common laborer. Sugar was not food, it was medicine, and in Europe it remained that way for nearly 1,000 years. The people who truly unlocked sugar's potential were Arab traders and chemists during the Islamic Golden Age. Between the 7th and 13th centuries, Arab scholars perfected the refining process, producing sugar that was whiter, finer, and longer-lasting than anything previously made in India. They built sugar mills across Persia, Egypt, and North Africa, planted sugarcane wherever the climate allowed, and traded refined sugar throughout the known world. By the time European crusaders arrived in the Levant in 1096, sugar was already deeply woven into Middle Eastern cuisine and medicine. The crusaders tasted it and were captivated. They called it a most precious product, and knights began carrying bags of sugar back to Europe alongside their swords and holy relics. Venice, positioned at the crossroads of East and West, became Europe's gateway for sugar. Venetian merchants imported raw sugar from the Middle East, refined it locally, and sold it across the continent at staggering markups. For nearly 200 years, Venice held an effective monopoly on the European sugar trade, and the profits were immense. In medieval Europe, sugar was treated much the way we value gold today. Kings displayed elaborate sugar sculptures at royal banquets to demonstrate wealth. English monarchs kept detailed sugar inventories, much like modern governments track gold reserves. At the wedding feast of Henry III in 1236, the royal household purchased more than 300 pounds of sugar for a single celebration, a sum worth more than a knight's annual income. Apothecaries locked it behind their counters beside opium and rare spices. It was prescribed for everything from coughs to depression. If you could afford sugar, you were somebody. If you could not, chances were you had never tasted it. But there was a problem. Sugarcane requires tropical or subtropical climates. You cannot grow it in England, you cannot grow it in France, and you certainly cannot grow it in Scandinavia. European demand was exploding, yet the entire supply depended on trade with the Islamic world, a trade route that was expensive, unreliable, and politically unstable. This is the part of sugar's history that most people never learn, and it is the part that reshaped the modern world. During the 1400s, Portugal began colonizing Atlantic islands such as Madeira, the Canary Islands, and São Tomé off the west coast of Africa. These islands had the perfect climate for sugarcane. Portuguese planters established the first European-controlled sugar plantations. They needed labor. At first, they relied on convicts and poor Europeans. It did not last. Sugar cultivation was brutally demanding. Planting, harvesting, and processing sugarcane required exhausting physical labor in extreme heat, often lasting 18 to 20 hours a day during harvest season. Workers collapsed from exhaustion, injury, and disease. Portugal turned to enslaved Africans. The sugar plantations of São Tomé became a testing ground for what would evolve into one of the most horrific labor systems in modern history. Then, when Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he carried sugarcane cuttings with him on his second voyage. The Caribbean was perfect, the climate was perfect, the soil was perfect, and European demand seemed endless. The process of making sugar was itself a kind of hell. After cutting sugarcane by hand with machetes under the tropical sun, workers had only hours to feed the stalks into massive grinding mills before the juice spoiled. The mills were powered by oxen, water, and later by wind, operating around the clock during harvest season. Workers feeding cane into the rollers risked losing fingers, hands, and arms. Plantation owners kept hatchets nearby, so trapped limbs could be severed before an entire body was dragged into the machinery. After crushing, the juice was boiled through a series of copper kettles over roaring fires, each hotter than the last. The boiling houses often exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns from splashing molten sugar were constant. The work never stopped. What followed was an explosion in sugar production that reshaped the Atlantic world. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all raced to establish sugar colonies throughout the Caribbean and South America. Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, and Brazil became vast sugar-producing regions. By the 1650s, tiny Barbados, roughly the size of San Antonio, Texas, was producing more sugar than all of Brazil. It became the most valuable colony in the entire British Empire, worth more than all the North American colonies combined. The human cost was catastrophic. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, roughly 12.5 million enslaved Africans were forced onto ships crossing the Atlantic. A huge proportion of them ended up on sugar plantations. Conditions were so brutal that the average life expectancy of an enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar plantation was just 7 years after arrival. 7 years. Plantation owners calculated that working people to death and replacing them was cheaper than providing humane living conditions. Sugar did not merely benefit from slavery, sugar drove slavery. It became the economic engine that made the transatlantic slave trade enormously profitable. A planter choosing sugarcane over tobacco or cotton set in motion an economic system that would shape global commerce for the next 300 years. By the 1700s, sugar had become the most valuable commodity traded across the Atlantic, more valuable than tobacco, cotton, or coffee. Its profits built mansions in London and Paris. They financed navies. They funded wars. The so-called triangle trade carried manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean, and sugar from the Caribbean back to Europe. Every corner of that triangle was drenched in sugar money. England became particularly obsessed. By 1700, the average English person consumed about 4 pounds of sugar each year. By 1800, that figure had climbed to 18 pounds annually. Sugar had transformed from a luxury enjoyed by the elite into something the middle class expected in every afternoon cup of tea. This was no accident. British merchants and politicians actively encouraged sugar consumption because the colonies producing it were making them extraordinarily wealthy. But sugar plantations also produced something the colonial powers never anticipated: resistance. On the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, enslaved workers launched the only successful large-scale slave revolt in history. In 1791, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people rose up, burned plantations to the ground, and fought a 12-year war against French, Spanish, and British forces. By 1804, they had won. Haiti became the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. It was born on sugar plantations. The Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves across Europe. France lost its richest colony almost overnight. Napoleon, who had envisioned a vast sugar empire in the Americas, was forced to rethink his ambitions. In 1803, he sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States for about $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre, partly because, without Haiti's sugar revenues, holding such a massive territory no longer made financial sense. Sugar's collapse in Haiti literally doubled the size of the United States. Napoleon also faced another crisis. Britain's Royal Navy had blockaded French ports, cutting off Caribbean sugar supplies. France needed sweetness. It needed a domestic alternative. Napoleon turned to sugar beets. Decades earlier, German chemist Andreas Marggraf had discovered that European beets contained sucrose chemically identical to cane sugar. Napoleon invested heavily in beet sugar production, ordering tens of thousands of acres planted across France, offering generous bounties to farmers, and creating research institutions dedicated to improving beet yields. It worked. By 1813, France was producing millions of pounds of beet sugar each year. For the first time in thousands of years, the monopoly of tropical sugarcane had been broken. A rivalry emerged: tropical cane sugar versus temperate beet sugar, Caribbean colonies versus European farms. Competition drove prices down and production higher. By the mid-1800s, sugar had become cheaper than at any previous point in human history, and cheaper sugar meant more sugar in more foods, consumed by more people. The Industrial Revolution accelerated this transformation. Steam-powered mills crushed cane faster than humans or animals ever could. Railroads moved raw cane from fields to factories within hours. Refining technology advanced until producers created sugar so white and so fine that it barely resembled the rough brown crystals first made in ancient India. White sugar became a symbol of purity and modernity. Brown sugar, despite being nearly identical except for trace minerals, came to be viewed as inferior. Then came the partnership that would shape modern eating habits: sugar and tea. Britain already imported enormous quantities of tea from China. Tea by itself was bitter. Sugar made it irresistible. By 1850, British workers drank an average of 2 cups of sweetened tea every day. Between 1840 and 1860, Britain's sugar imports doubled. The government even reduced sugar tariffs to keep the working class fed, productive, and content. Cheap, sweetened tea became the unofficial fuel of the British Empire. By the late 1800s, sugar had spread into every corner of Western cuisine. Jams, candies, baked goods, sweetened drinks. There was a darker reason behind this explosion. Sugar delivered cheap, fast calories. Factory workers enduring 12 to 14-hour shifts needed quick energy, and sugar provided it. Industrialists embraced it because sugary tea and jam sandwiches kept workers productive without the expense of serving substantial meals. Sugar became the fuel of industrial capitalism. In 1886, the Coca-Cola Company was founded. By the early 1900s, Coca-Cola was selling millions of bottles each year, each loaded with sugar. Other soda companies followed. Candy bars appeared. Breakfast cereals evolved from plain oats into sugar-coated products. The 20th century saw sugar consumption in America reach levels no civilization had ever experienced. By 1970, the average American consumed more than 100 pounds of sugar every year. Think about that, 100 pounds. Roughly the weight of a large dog consumed in sugar by every man, woman, and child each year. And the sugar industry knew there was a problem. As early as the 1950s, internal research at major sugar companies linked excessive sugar consumption to heart disease. Instead of sharing the findings, the industry buried them. In 1967, the Sugar Research Foundation paid 3 Harvard scientists the equivalent of roughly $50,000 in today's money to publish a review minimizing sugar's role in heart disease while shifting blame toward dietary fat. Published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the paper shaped nutrition policy for decades. For nearly 30 years, Americans were told that fat was the enemy. Food companies removed fat from countless products and quietly replaced it with sugar. The result was an explosion of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease affecting millions. The industry had the evidence, but chose profit over public health. The cover-up began unraveling in 2016 when researchers at the University of California, San Francisco uncovered internal sugar industry documents. They revealed a strategy remarkably similar to the tobacco industry's playbook: create doubt, fund favorable research, attack critics, and delay regulation. Meanwhile, another sweetener was transforming the food supply. In the early 1970s, Japanese scientists developed high-fructose corn syrup. By 1984, Coca-Cola and Pepsi had switched to it in their American products because it was cheaper, easier to transport, and blended smoothly into beverages. Within a decade, it had replaced cane sugar in most processed foods and drinks across the United States. Today, the average American consumes around 17 teaspoons of added sugar every day, roughly 2 to 3 times the amount recommended by the American Heart Association. Sugar hides in pasta sauce, bread, salad dressing, yogurt, granola bars, and countless everyday foods. A single can of soda contains about 10 teaspoons of sugar, more than an entire day's recommended limit. The consequences are staggering. More than 42% of American adults are classified as obese. More than 37 million Americans have diabetes, while another 96 million have prediabetes. Heart disease remains the leading cause of death in the United States. Sugar is not the only cause, but decades of research now confirm it is one of the most significant contributors. The global picture is equally alarming. Worldwide sugar production now exceeds 180 million tons every year. Brazil is the largest producer, followed by India, the same nation that first discovered sugar crystallization thousands of years ago. The average person on Earth now consumes about 50 pounds of sugar annually, and that number continues to rise as Western diets spread throughout developing countries. Some governments have started pushing back. Mexico introduced a soda tax in 2014, and consumption fell by roughly 12% during the first year. The United Kingdom followed with its own sugar levy in 2018, encouraging beverage companies to reduce sugar content before the tax even took effect. Several American cities, including Berkeley, Philadelphia, and Seattle, introduced local sugar taxes. Sugar's story spans 10,000 years, 6 continents, and nearly every defining historical event of the past 5 centuries. It was there when empires rose. It was there when millions were enslaved. It was there when revolutions erupted and colonies collapsed. It was there when the Industrial Revolution transformed civilization. And it is here today, in almost everything we eat and drink, shaping our health, our economies, and our politics in ways most people rarely consider. A 10,000-year-old grass from the jungles of New Guinea became one of the most consequential crops in human history. It built fortunes, it destroyed lives, it toppled empires, and today it is sitting in your kitchen, In your cereal, your ketchup, your bread, waiting to be noticed. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind the everyday things that shape our world. We have many more stories coming.